Excellent. We have the last two chapters of the book, and then we have covered everything for the Security Plus exam, and we'll be left with doing test prep until the end of the semester. So the last two things that need to be covered are the security policies, standards, and compliance, along with risk management and privacy. This is where we start to get away from all the fun stuff that we like, all the fun techie stuff, and now we're talking more business, more of how the people who sign our checks talk and be able to speak their language so that we can get a job and get a paycheck. So the first thing that we need to talk about is policies. A policy is a high-level statement of management intent with a mandatory compliance. An InfoSec policy will contain broad statements like the importance of cybersecurity to the organization, the requirement that all staff and contractors take measures to protect information and systems, statement on the ownership of information created and processed by the organization, designation of the CISO or any other executive responsible for cybersecurity issues, the delegation of authority granting that executive to create the standards, procedures, and guidelines that will implement the policy. The process to create a policy is very laborious and requires very high-level approval. Keeping policy statements high level provides CISOs or CISOs with flexibility to adapt and change with the environment. Lengthy security policies quickly become outdated as necessary changes to individual requirements get accumulated and become neglected as staff become weary of continually publishing new policy versions. Some things that you typically find in an InfoSec policy are things like information security, the high-level authority or guidance for the security of the program, the acceptable use policies, clear direction for users on permissible uses of information resources, data governance policies, states the ownership of information created and used by the organization, data classification, which is a formal structure to process and assign classification to data, whether secret, top secret, confidential. The data retention policy, what information will be maintained, the length of the time for each category until destruction. Credential management, everything from creating accounts, active use, and decommissioning. Password policies, continuous monitoring, things like watching employees' activity, the code of conduct or code of ethics, the expected behavior of all employees, change management and control, how the review, approval, and implementation of changes that are proposed to systems and their cycle, along with asset management, accepting any new devices into inventory, tracking their lifetime, and properly disposing of them at the end of their life. All these things are various policies that CISOs would need to make, update, enforce. And again, a policy is a high level, but has mandatory compliance. A standard provides mandatory requirements describing how an organization will carry out the policies. Standards include specific configuration settings for operating systems, controls for highly sensitive information, and so on. Standards are typically approved at lower levels in the organization and may change regularly, whereas policies not so much. Organizations may operate in industries that have commonly accepted standards that must be followed or choose a best practice. Failure to comply to standards can be seen as negligence and cause for legal liability. So again, where a policy will be a high-level statement, a standard provides details on how to execute the policy. Procedures are much more detailed step-by-step mandatory processes that individuals and organizations must follow in specific circumstances. Similar to checklists, procedures ensure a consistent process for achieving a security objective, such as building a new system, releasing code, responding to security incidents, and so on. Organizations commonly include things like monitoring, how security monitoring will be performed, evidence production, how to respond to subpoenas, court orders, and other legal requests, and patching, the frequency and process of applying patches to applications and systems. All these things are procedures. Last at the bottom of the list of importance is guidelines. They provide best practices and recommendations, and they are offered in the spirit of helpful advice, but they are not mandatory. The optionality may vary significantly depending on the culture of the organization. But just remember, a policy is high level and is mandatory to comply. A standard gives you requirements on how an organization will carry out a policy. The procedure is the detailed step-by-step mandatory process. And a guideline is not mandatory. It may have best practices, but they're all just recommendations. Security policies should provide a mechanism for exception to the rules. Unforeseen circumstances will arise that require a deviation. The framework should lay out the exception and the individual or the committee with authority to approve exceptions, because you can't really plan for absolutely every single possibility. There's just way too many. Compensating controls mitigate the risk associated with exceptions to security standards. They find alternative means to achieve an objective when the organization can't meet the original control requirement. These controls balance the fact that it isn't possible to implement every required security control in every circumstance with the desire to manage risk to the greatest feasible degree. Many organizations adopt compensating controls to address a temporary exception to a security requirement, along with remediation plans to return to compliance. So from there, we move on to personal management, where we have the least privileged principle, which says the individual should be granted only the minimum set of permissions necessary to carry out their job functions. It's a very simple concept with a very challenging implementation in practice, because privileges have to be specifically issued. Privilege creep occurs when an employee moves from job to job within the organization, accumulating new privileges without the past ones being revoked. There's a separation of duties. No single person may have the privileges required to perform one or more or two or more important tasks. For example, an accountant cannot create a new vendor and issue a check. This requires the accountant employee who wishes to steal funds to solicit the collusion of at least another employee, reducing the risk of fraudulent activity. Another way of separating duties is an administrator for a system is also not the administrator for the network. You have a network admin and a system admin. Two-person control is a concept that is similar to separation of duty. Instead of preventing the same person from holding two different privileges that are sensitive when used together, two-person control requires the participation of two people to perform a single sensitive action. Just like the nukes and having two people with a separate key that have to turn it at the same time. Job rotation takes employees with sensitive roles and moves them periodically to other positions in the organization. This is good as many types of fraud require ongoing concealment activities that could be discovered by the replacement employee. Mandatory vacations serve a similar purpose by forcing employees to take an annual vacation and revoking their access privileges during that vacation to perform an audit on the account. So while they're out and about, they can't log in. The admins log in and do an audit and see what that user has been doing. So again, find things like fraud, find things like exfiltration, all kinds of stuff. Clean desk is designed to protect the confidentiality of sensitive information by limiting the amount of paper or other things left exposed or unattended on employees' desk, and require that all papers and other materials be secured before an employee leaves their desk. A clean desk policy would prevent this issue from happening, where a password is written out on a sticky note and it's left on a screen. And then anybody with a smartphone can take a picture, zoom in, see what the password is, and wreak havoc. The second half of this one is a little more tricky. In onboarding, and for both, really, it ensures the organization retains control of its assets and handles the granting or revocation of credentials and privileges in an orderly manner. New hires should include a background check designed to uncover any criminal activity and other past behavior that may indicate a potential employee poses an undetected risk. The problem with offboarding is it tends to not go on always in good terms, and you need to be able to, for example, capture all the credentials and anything that they have access to and revoke access to it. It's a little more trickier. It can be a little more dramatic. It honestly shouldn't be, but we're dealing with humans, so things happen. NDAs require employees protect any confidential information they gain access to in the course of their employment. Organizations normally ask the employees to sign an NDA upon hire and periodically remind them of their responsibilities. An offboarding process would involve an exit interview that includes a final reminder of the employee's responsibility to abide by the terms of that NDA. Can't ignore social media nowadays. Organizations that choose to adopt social media policies will put that constraint on their employees. So analysis performed by the organization can include assessment of personal and professional accounts, as that activity may reflect positively or negatively upon the organization. These policies, where we're walking into the personal realm, should be made clear to employees, both potential and future. And the flip from the grim is user training. Users should receive regular security awareness training to ensure they understand the risks associated with the computing environment and the role in minimizing risks. I would also add physical, because I believe that the physical and the virtual world are one. Not every user requires the same level of training. Role-based training focuses on job responsibilities. Phishing simulations can test all users of their skills. And gamification, which is my favorite, can help users retain information with fun exercises. We also can't ignore our third parties, our vendors, our suppliers, our contractors. Many risks come from these third parties. So your organization should deploy some standard agreements and practices, like a master service agreement that is an umbrella contract for the work a vendor does over a period of time. It can have detailed security and privacy requirements. Each project should always have a statement of work that contains project-specific details and references the master service agreement. There's the service level agreement, a contract that's specific to the conditions of service that will be provided by the vendor, along with the remedies to the customer should the vendor fail to meet their SLA. These things can cover things like system availability, data durability, and response time. There are memorandums of understanding, letter written that document specific aspects of the relationship, and business partnership agreements, where two organizations agree to do business with each other. And of course, organizations should take steps to ensure they have an orderly transition whenever the relationship ends or a product is discontinued or a service. On top of all that, we have laws and regulations to be aware of. It all depends on what you're doing. So if you're doing anything with health, you need to be aware, pretty well aware, of the Health Information Portability and Accounting Act, otherwise known as HIPAA. If you are dealing with anything credit card, you have to be well versed in the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. GLBA covers US financial institutions. Sarbanes-Oxley applies also to financial records of US publicly traded companies. GDPR is anything to do with EU, with the European Union, and data coming in and out of the EU. FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, is for US educational institutions to implement security and privacy controls, along with many more other laws, both national, state, and local, that may affect the business you work for or work with. This is where having a legal counsel and subject matter experts comes into play, because a lot can apply to what you do. We also have standard frameworks. NIST is one. The cybersecurity framework, the CSF, released in 2018 with 5 objectives and 3 components shown here, with a sound approach to developing and evaluating the state of cybersecurity programs. I highly suggest taking the time to read up on the updated document and training for the framework. There's also the NIST Risk Management Framework, another one that you should be familiar with. Security Plus does cover these two. RMF, the second one I'm showing you, is a formal process for implementing security controls and authorizing system use, whereas CSF, the first, is a broad structure for cybersecurity controls. So knowing the the names of the different frameworks, like identity, protect, detect, respond, recover. The three components, the core, the tiers, and profile. And again, not knowing them in the sense of like being able to recite them, but having an understanding what they mean. And I have the objectives and components in the notes for you to read. They're not that long. It's just a helpful reminder when you take the test and you see those things come up, and you can put two and two together. There are some ISO standards that you should be familiar with. There's the ISO 27001 or 27001. It has 14 categories. It's a commonly used InfoSec standard, but it's pretty much fallen out of popularity out of highly regulated industries. It does cover cybersecurity. ISO 27002 goes beyond control objectives and describes actual controls in organizations. Controls an organization may implement to meet objectives. This one covers privacy. 27701 is a standard guidance for managing privacy controls and is an extension of the first two. And 31,000 provides guides for risk management programs in a general way. Knowing these little things will be enough to help you in the test. Again, you don't need to have an in-depth knowledge of every single standard and every little thing and be able to quote it like a rap song. You don't need to do that. You just need to remember what they stand for and a general sense of what they cover. That will be enough to help you in the test. So the last thing in this chapter is the security control verification and quality control. Audits are a formal review of an organization's security program or specific compliance issues conducted on behalf of a third party. Audits require rigorous formal testing of controls and result in a formal statement regarding the entity's compliance. Audits can be done by internal audit groups or external firms. A service organization control, or SOC, audit under the American Institute for Certified Public Accountants has three different assessing engagements for an organization. You have SOC 1, which controls that might impact the accuracy of financial reporting. You have SOC 2, affect the security, the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and privacy of information stored on a system. SOC 2 audits are confidential and shared outside an organization under an NDA. SOC 3 is the same as SOC 2, but the results are intended for the public. On top of this, there are two types of SOC reports. There's the type 1, which is the auditor's opinion on the description provided by management and suitability of the control design. And type 2, who goes further and confirms the controls are functioning properly, not property. So again, you don't have to have an intensive, in-depth knowledge of those 5 things that I mentioned, the 3 SOCs and their 2 types. But you need to be able to recall that SOC 3 is the same as SOC 2, but the results are intended to go public. SOC 2 does the CIA and privacy, and the results are confidential and only go outside for an NDA. A type 1 is an auditor's opinion of the control design. Type 2 confirms the opinion. Any questions before I move on to the last chapter? Okay. Well, seeing none, I'll move on to the last chapter, risk management and privacy. Our entire career and existence in this field is based on risk. Organizations must take a formal approach to risk analysis that begins with identifying the risks, determining the severity of each risk, and adopting one or more risk management strategies to address the risks. The big three are threats, any possible event that might have an adverse effect on the CIA of information or their systems. Vulnerabilities, the weakness in our system or controls that could be exploited by said threat. And in the middle, the risk, the intersection of a vulnerability and a threat that might exploit the vulnerability. A threat without a corresponding vulnerability does not pose a risk. Neither does a vulnerability without a corresponding threat. First, we have identification. Identifying the threats and vulnerabilities that exist in the environment through things, the things that could be like external stuff, like malware, natural disasters, adversaries. Internal, any malicious insiders, mistakes from authorized users, equipment failures. Multi-party, things like power outages or SaaS provider compromise. Legal or legacy, outdated systems with unpatchable vulnerabilities. Intellectual property, any trade secrets that could compromise the business. And software compliance or licensing, intentionally or accidentally running afoul of usage limitations. After identifying threats and vulnerabilities, we have to do some math. Boo. But again, this is talking business. When evaluating any risk, we always multiply two factors: the likelihood or the probability that a risk will occur. This is the percent chance that a threat will exploit a vulnerability over a specific period of time. And we also have the magnitude of impact that the risk will have on the organization if it occurs. This equation should not always be interpreted literally. It's best to think conceptually as combining the likelihood and impact to determine the severity of a risk. Laws and regulations may play a significant role in determining the impact of a risk. The formalized approach to risk prioritization that allows organizations to conduct the reviews in a structured manner is the quantitative and the qualitative. The quantitative uses numerical data in the analysis, resulting in a straightforward prioritization of tasks. We determine the asset value, typically written as AV. So determine the asset value affected by the risk in dollars, using cost to acquire, replace, or depreciated cost of asset. You got to determine the likelihood the risk will occur, the number of times the risk is expected each year as an annual rate of occurrence. So if a risk happens twice a year, then the annual rate of occurrence, or ARO, is 2. If the annual rate of occurrence is once every 100 years, then it's 0.01. You determine the amount of damage that will occur if this risk materializes. That would be the exposure factor, or EF, expressed as a percentage of the asset expected to be damaged. So a completely destroyed asset would have an EF of 100%. So taking those three things, taking the asset value, the annual rate of occurrence, and exposure factor, we can calculate the single loss expectancy. This is the amount of financial damage expected each time a risk materializes. How much money are we going to lose when said risk happens? Again, we're talking business. There's also the annualized loss expectancy, the amount of damage we expect from a risk every year, which would be taking a single loss expectancy and multiplying that against the annual rate of occurrence. Organizations can use the annual loss expectancy to prioritize remediation activities and the appropriate level of investment in controls to mitigate those risks. Now, I mentioned there's a second, and that's the qualitative. This is subjective judgments and categories, allowing assessment of risks that are too difficult to quantify for evaluating financial or other risks that can be expressed in numeric terms. This uses the same probability and magnitude actors to evaluate the severity of a risk, but using more subjective categories. Something like this. We're not really using math. We don't have really the numbers to do it, but we can say the probability versus magnitude of something happening, of a risk from a threat and vulnerability. Now, to manage the risk, we have a couple of ways, as shown here. We have the mitigation, the process of applying risk security controls to reduce the probability or the magnitude of a risk. It's the most common of them all. Risk avoidance changes business practice to completely eliminate the potential of a risk. This may seem highly desirable. It's not the most viable, though, because turning off our company website in order to avoid a DDoS attack isn't, that's just dumb. There's risk transference, shifting some of the impact of a risk to another entity, like insurance. The customer pays a premium to the insurance carrier and agrees to cover losses from risk in the policy, such as lost revenue during an attack. The last one is acceptance. Deliberately choose to take no other risk management strategy and simply continue as normal. So we can either mitigate or reduce the risk. We can avoid it altogether. We can transfer it or accept it. Risk analysis helps communicate to professionals and business leaders using tools to help make it easy for them to understand and comprehend. Yes, it does mean pretending that your business leaders are a bunch of kindergartners and the only way they're going to get it is by color coding. Yes, that is what that means. So you got the nice professional way of saying it, using tools to make it easy to understand for them to comprehend. And you got the straightforward, yeah, just pretend they're kindergartners. How do you tell them this is bad, this is good? Yeah. Hey, as long as it works, that's all that matters. Well, we have risks, we have our threats, we have our vulnerabilities. You know, sometimes it is going to happen. So what do? Because disasters will happen. That's just life. We got everything from natural to external or internal, man-made, so on and so forth. So how do we react? Hey, why is there no picture? That's weird. Anyway, What is the business impact analysis? Because again, disasters will happen. We have the mean time between failures, or MTFB, the measure of reliability of the system. So if the mean time between failure is 6 months, you can expect the system to fail once every 6 months. The mean time to repair is the average amount of time to restore a system after a failure. So if our mean time between failures is 6 months and it takes 3 hours to restore, now you have those two numbers. The mean time to repair will be 3 hours. So 3 hours in every year, we're going to lose 6 hours because our system will fail once every 6 months. You have the recovery time objective, the amount of time the organization can tolerate a system being down. It's obviously good to have repair times less than the RTO. And the recovery point objective, the amount of data and the organization can tolerate losing during an outage. Always pay attention to any single points of failure. Always evaluate the impact of different risks on the operation and the acceptability of said risks. The last item, the very last item, is privacy. We are responsible for protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of all information under our care. If improperly disclosed, we would jeopardize individuals as well as organizations. Privacy breaches always have a negative impact on those affected. Organizations can adopt a privacy notice that outlines their commitments along with laws and regulations they must follow within terms of agreement with customers and stakeholders. You have sensitive information inventory that again depends on what you're working with. Could be things like personally identifiable information or PII. You have protected health information. You have financial and government. Speaking of, our government uses the classifications unclassified, confidential, secret, and top secret. Businesses don't really have a set list, but they can use anything from like public, private, sensitive, confidential, critical, proprietary, and the others I mentioned. The people who are responsible for privacy are like the data controllers who determine the reasons for processing information and direct the methods for processing data. The data stewards who carry out the intent of the controller and delegate responsibility from it. The custodians, individuals or teams who do not have control stewardship, but responsible for secure safekeeping of information. And the data processors, the ones who actually process the data. All data has a life cycle. At the early stages, data minimalization enables the collection of the smallest possible amount of data necessary. Non-necessary information should be discarded or not even collected in the first place. Purpose limitation means data should only be used for the purpose it was originally collected and consented by the subjects. Data retention guides the end of the life cycle, kept as long as necessary to fulfill the purpose, and then securely destroyed. Data privacy enhancing technologies are things like hashing. Use a hash value to replace the original value. Tokenization, replacing sensitive values with a unique identifier in a lookup table. And data masking, like when you enter your social security number and it turns into a bunch of little asterisks. And the final item is the notification when a breach occurs. Your incident response plan should be activated. Organizations have responsibility under national and regional laws to make public notifications and disclosure in the wake of a data breach, which can be limited to notifying the individuals, the government regulators, and or the news media. Any questions on this chapter? All right, well, seeing none. The last assignment is to select 3 companies and find at least 4 documents and policies that are mentioned in the module. And you're answering some basic questions. How easy was it to find? How understandable was it? If you're working for the company, how easy or difficult does it look like to implement? In case you choose your own. If you chose SOC reports, how easy was it to comprehend the report? And how useful are they to the general public? As always, everything is due on the 7th. As we're getting closer to the edge of the term. I believe we are under 20 days. I'll double check, but yeah, we're running close to the edge now. So make sure you get all your assignments in before that due until date. And like I said, next week we will be doing test prep, where I'll be going through questions from the very last item from here. We'll spend our hour doing various questions from here and answering them to the best of our ability. Give you some test taking tips, help you out in getting into the right mindset. And we'll be doing that until the end of the semester. Any questions before I end the stream? Okay. I hope you guys have a good afternoon.